Why is modern art so controversial? I think to begin to answer that question, we need to go back to the 19th century. We can look at the Impressionists in France to get an understanding of how controversy and the art market were kind of married together. Let's go jump into the Musée d'Orsay in Paris to find out. There she is, Degas' little dancer, 14 years old. We're here in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, a museum that was created from a dilapidated train station in the 1980s. In just about every way, this museum is the opposite of the Louvre. It is small and intimate, easy to see in a single afternoon, and focused on art created in the 19th century and later. Rooms are filled with famous masterpieces by the Impressionists and those who came after them. Who were they? Well, the Impressionists were a collection of artists who exhibited together for just under a decade in the 1870s, more or less, artists who shared an interest in non-traditional art techniques. They rarely mixed color on the palette, didn't use black and white to create tones. They were very interested in painting the way that light interacts with objects, so they tended to paint outdoors. They were wrapped up in a nostalgic loss of nature due to industrialization, and they wanted to explore new techniques that didn't include traditional modeling of the figure, but rather they found a way to experiment with what the brush could do. Oh, and they were very interested in unconventional subject matter. Now, where does all of this come from? A new thing called the art market. When the church stopped being the main patron of arts in Europe, as the Renaissance ended in the late 16th century, it set in motion a chain of events in the art world that ultimately created a market for speculative artwork. That is, artists experimenting with new ideas, ways to be innovative, to push the boundaries of what art was, to break the old rules of so-called aesthetic beauty. That's how Impressionism actually got its name, because a journalist commenting on the very first show of these artists, such as Monet, Degas, and Renoir, he picked out the 1872 painting by Monet called Impression Sunrise and coined a new term, Impressionism. It was actually meant to be derogatory, and that term stuck. But what does all of this have to do with Little Dancer, 14 years old? Well, in sculpture, this small bronze does a lot of the important things that I just described about Impressionism. We have unconventional subject matter displayed in a new and experimental way. First, we have a bronze cast that employs non-traditional materials. The taffeta of her dress and the ribbon in her hair are not bronze representations, but they're actually the real thing. 12 or so of these little dancers were cast, and each one is a little different in that the tutus are not the same, and the ribbon are different as well. Now, who is she? She's not the principal ballerina of any national or acclaimed ballet. Just the opposite, in fact. She is typical studio rat, as they were called. That is, poor children who were filling the ranks of the ballet in the background, dirty, never able to rise to the top because of their low social status, often taken advantage of by men who hung around the studios. She is a nobody, in specific, but she stands in for all of the studio rats. But she does have specific physical qualities. Look at her forehead, and you'll see that Degas has pushed it in somewhat, likely because she is of some Algerian blood in her, maybe a mixed race, which would make her social status even more complicated. And look at her pose. Hands behind her back, but shoulders thrust back in defiance. Proud, but poor. And so, we then need to ask if this sculpture, which is a casting, by the way, a mold of clay that was therefore additive, not a subtractive method like creating a carved stone sculpture. It's additive. You build the clay around a maquette or a base mold, and then you build on and on the clay, and then eventually you cast it using the lost wax method in bronze. Was this sculpture controversial when it was originally exhibited? You might think so, but it's a kind of a complicated answer because Degas was only known to have shown this clay model once, and it was not cast, as far as I know, in his lifetime. He showed it to a few artists and friends, and most of them hated it. And so this clay model and about 100 others like it, very small ones, much smaller than this, were only discovered in his studio after his death, and only then were they cast in bronze, which is a very expensive process. But look at how he captures her youth, her boldness, her confidence, her physicality. She is taking up the space. Though she is not overly large, she commands the space that she's in. She electrifies the space around it with her quiet confidence.